When the United States attacked Truk Lagoon in February of 1944 as part of an operation against Japanese forces during World War II, comparisons to the Pearl Harbor attack were immediate. Located in the Caroline Islands, Truk was used by the Japanese Navy to store oil and supplies and served as an anchorage for its massive combined fleet. The coral atoll surrounding the islands provided a safe harbor. It was so heavily protected by anti-aircraft guns, airfields, and shore batteries that it earned the nickname of the Gibraltar of the Pacific. However, by 1944, the island became unsustainable as the Allied forces were closing in, and Japan began a slow withdrawal of troops and supplies. The American attack took the Japanese forces by surprise, and their defenses were completely torn apart. To this day, Truk Lagoon is regarded as one of the biggest graveyards of ships in the world. Japan's Pacific Fortress. Truk had been home to several local tribes, going as far back as when Spanish explorers discovered it in 1528, before the conquest of the Philippines. It consisted of a cumulus of rocky islands and mountain peaks, surrounded by a natural 40-mile barrier reef with several entrances. The area is part of the federal states of Micronesia and is located about 1,000 miles from New Guinea in the West Pacific. The Spanish crown formally claimed it in the mid-1850s, but sold it to the Germans in 1899, after the Spanish Armada lost Cuba and the Philippines to the U.S. during the American invasions of 1898. After the culmination of the First World War, Germany was forced to surrender the few colonies it owned in Africa and the Pacific, and Japan claimed Truk Lagoon. The Japanese then built a harbor, barracks, and depots for supplies. As the Empire planned its expansionist campaigns within the continent, its navy employed the island as its main naval base. A large portion of the Japanese fleet was anchored in the lagoon, and about 40,000 men were stationed there. In early 1939, after taking China, Truk Lagoon was expanded to house the Imperial Navy's Fourth Fleet, also known as the South Seas Force. After the conquest of the Philippines, the Fourth Fleet was integrated into the Combined Fleet, and up to 5 airfields were built in the area to allow more aircraft ready for battle. The seaplane bases were constructed in the Dublan and Moen Islands, while the land airfields were erected in Eten, Moen, and Param. The naval installations were also built in Dublan, which had an impressive 2,500-ton floating dry dock. Between 1941 and 1942, the Imperial Navy's carriers and battleships were stationed in Truk due to its strategic position for offensive operations. The location allowed Japanese naval and air units to swiftly counter Allied operations all the way from New Guinea to the Solomon and Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, Wake Island, and the Marianas. During August of 1942, the commander of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, established his headquarters in Truk, aboard the world's biggest and most lethal warship ever built, the Yamato. In addition, Admiral Meinechi Koga arrived at Truk aboard Yamamoto's sister ship, Musashi, after Yamamoto passed away in April of 1943. Truk Lagoon quickly became the Japanese's most significant fleet anchorage in the Pacific. The Gibraltar of the Pacific. Before World War II broke out, the secrecy surrounding Japan's activity in Truk gave way to a myth that quickly reached American and British ears. The rumors of the Empire building an impregnable fortress in Truk Lagoon earned it the nickname of the Gibraltar of the Pacific. As the war raged on and the American advances in the Pacific increased, the island would end up being known as Japan's Pearl Harbor. But American intelligence proved exaggerated. There was no major docking or dry docking facilities in Truk. Supplies, oil, and ammunition were transported from Dublan to vessels anchored in the lagoon, and the Imperial Japanese Army realized it needed to fortify its defenses, as it was highly vulnerable against the approaching Allied forces. The island's anti-aircraft defenses and coastal batteries were then strengthened with ground reinforcements built by the Army's 52nd Division between November 1943 and January 1944. These additions included more machine gun emplacements, bomb-resistant tunnels, and air raid shelters. Further measures were taken to protect the facilities that stored 80,000 tons of fuel, divided between a 10,000-ton underground tank and two 35,000-ton surface steel tanks. The facilities included a 3,345-feet bomber airstrip, a submarine base, a 2,500-ton floating dry dock, an aviation repair station, several radars, a torpedo boat base, and the 5 airstrips previously constructed. Dozens of anti-aircraft guns and dual-purpose guns were also part of the defensive system, including machine gun emplacements and an array of other artillery systems. The upgrades would be finished in February of 1944, just before an American task force was dispatched to attack Truk. Operation Hailstone. At the end of 1943, General Douglas MacArthur and the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, decided it was time to launch an aggressive operation to overtake Truk. Nimitz chose Rear Admiral Mark Pete Mitcher as the task force commander, and the operation was dubbed Hailstone. As the Japanese first spotted 2 Marine Corps B-24 Liberator bombers flying over the area in early 1944, they realized an enemy invasion was forthcoming. However, the Japanese High Command never contemplated the level of aggression the Americans were about to display, and they didn't know the U.S. was organizing 3 consecutive operations in the Marshalls, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. The Japanese Navy divided its forces over different islands to stop the Marines, but because of this strategy, their overall combat strength was reduced, and many resources were wasted by moving around. More importantly, U.S. Navy submarines were slowly approaching the waters around Truk to prey upon the Japanese supply carriers. Admiral Minichi Koga, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, then issued orders to leave the port as quickly as possible and to take as many supplies from the island as they could. They would not be coming back. The battle. After U.S. forces gathered data from their 2 Liberator bombers, Task Forces 50 and 58 departed for Truk. They were commanded by Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance and Rear Admiral Mitcher. According to U.S. Navy historical records, the American force consisted of, quote, 4 new Essex-class carriers, Yorktown, Essex, Intrepid, and Bunker Hill, plus Enterprise, and 4 light carriers, Belleau Wood, Cabot, Monterey, and Cowpens, along with more than 500 aircraft. In addition, 6 new fast battleships, 10 cruisers, and 28 destroyers rounded out the force. Meanwhile, quote, the only 2 Japanese ships left in Truk were 2 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, and about 50 other auxiliaries, cargo ships, merchant ships, and patrol and service craft. The task forces arrived at Truk on February 17, 1944, and immediately launched a 72-plane fighter sweep from their carriers. The Japanese had been on alert for 2 weeks, but were still caught with their guard down. Their radars did not detect low-flying aircraft, and some of their pilots were on a short leave. Around 45 Japanese fighters took off minutes later, and another 45 eventually joined them during the fight. Still, they were incapable of achieving any type of formation while being incessantly attacked by the Americans. About 30 aircraft were shot down, and another 40 were immobilized by strafing runs before they could take off. Meanwhile, 18 American Avengers dropped fragmentation and incendiary bombs across the island, causing havoc among the Japanese garrison. And U.S. submarines destroyed several anchored merchant ships. By the next morning, the island's main facilities had been destroyed or almost consumed by fire. Out of 370 Japanese Zeros stationed at the 5 airfields, less than 100 remained. The surviving Japanese warships were preparing a risky escape with their few remaining aircraft as escorts. But by 5 a.m., more than 30 American airstrikes dropped hundreds of 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs, and the submarines launched 70 torpedoes, sinking the merchant tanker Hoyu Maru and the Ikoku Maru. A small Japanese warship fleet consisting of the cruiser Katori, destroyers Maikaze and Nawaki, auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru, and a minesweeper made way into the open sea, but were quickly swarmed by the American aircraft. Admiral Spruance then decided to confront them head-on and engage in ship-to-ship combat. The damaged Japanese ships did not stand a chance against the U.S. battleships, and only the Nawaki destroyer was able to escape. the biggest ship graveyard. The attack on Truk was a tremendous victory for the US Navy. The Japanese lost over 17,000 tons of stored fuel, and losses from merchant ships surpassed 200,000 tons. Over 4,500 Japanese personnel perished during the surprise attack, and 30 merchant ships, 6 auxiliary ships, 3 auxiliary cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 2 light cruisers were sunk. Truk immediately became one of the biggest ship graveyards in the world. With the territory now neutralized, the Americans were able to continue their advances to conquer Japan. The campaigns of Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa loomed ahead, and the battered Japanese would continue fighting to the last man. In 1969, French explorer Jacques Cousteau conducted an expedition in the lagoon and discovered the wreckages of a dozen Japanese ships. Some of the vessels were very close to each other and almost intact, and explorers were surprised to find the remains of many of the Japanese sailors still inside the ships. This prompted the government of Japan to give them a proper burial. Truk Lagoon has since become a tourist attraction, with its beautiful vistas and crystal-clear waters still covering an impressive amount of ships, aircraft, and supplies. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to our Dark Seas channel to explore more content about naval history. And tell us in the comments below about other topics of your interest.